Prison show is what I know. They bring in all these boys and girls all around the whole wide world. Prison show is what I know, but here we go. Whoa, prison show is what I know. They took me from my home, I can't get back. Told my family I wanna hold just to get her back. Oh, I can't do this no more. It's the prison show.
Hello viewers at home, my name is Bukola Oriola. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight I have a very important guest for you. We have been looking to get this interview for the past 2 years. So tonight we got a big catch for you. And you think you've heard about human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking. Wait till you hear our guest tell you about the trafficking of human parts. Hello, Professor Michele.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. I'm so grateful. And I've had some of my crew members that I told about you coming like 2 years ago, and they were like, human parts, we want to hear about that. It's going to be very interesting, but you know, due to different reasons, we couldn't have you then.
Well, it's wonderful that we can do this now. It's always the right timing when it comes about, as long as we're working in the right direction.
Yes. So I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for coming, for having us in your nice, comfortable home tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
So, you are in the law area. How long have you been dealing with the law and researching the law?
Questions about, researching the law and questions about human body parts and what we do with them. Over 20 years.
Whoa.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Time flies.
Yes. I could just imagine a 20-year-old child. Yes. Wow. That has been you must have a lot of wealth in this area. And what have you been finding out about that? Well, and why do you think people get involved in this kind of act?
My first introduction to thinking about trafficking actually began with sex trafficking. I was living in Europe. I was doing research on African immigration into European countries. And during that time, I became introduced to something that was absolutely startling. I was on a road trip from Rome up to Venice, and along the side of the road were African women, mostly from Nigeria, who had shirts off and just scarves around their waist, lining all up the road. It was absolutely shocking and fascinating. And what I learned through research and through working with fabulous professors there, the University of Rome, Clara Gallini was one of my advisors, is that these women were trafficked. And very often these women were trafficked by other women who were promised a job such as working in a trattoria or some sort of restaurant. And so they surrender their passports, they get the airfare to Italy, and then once in Italy, they had to work it off, right? There's no restaurant. And the way in which they work off the plane fare is to be on the side of the roads. It was absolutely startling. But shortly thereafter, I began thinking about what we do with the human body. What does the law have to say about the human body after it has died? Who owns it? Can it be traded? Can it be sold? Even in death, what are the rules around a corporation buying a plot of land that used to be a cemetery? Can they just move those graves?
So some corporations buy a place that used to be a cemetery?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes they don't know, sometimes they do know. You know, in the South in particular, and also in the North, in immigrant communities, where people buried their loved ones, were often on their land. Pieces of their land were often subdivided. In the subdividing of that land, if at some point a corporation approaches someone and says, we want to purchase this land here, and they say, well, sure, Well,
Whoa.
in the South, sometimes that means that there are grave sites. And in fact, for very poor families, immigrant families, poor African American families that could not afford any kind of tombstones or markers, then sometimes even extended members of the family wouldn't necessarily know where great grandmother is buried because there's no marker.
Yes.
But what we do know is that even those may be the more difficult cases. The more apparent cases are when the tombstones are actually there, and the gravestones are there, and the corporation says, "No, we want to build our mega corporation here, and we still want it." And then these questions get raised, and as it turns out, we have a bit of a mishmash of law. We've borrowed law from the English common law tradition. That's what much of our American law is based on. But beyond that, states have individually developed their own rules about what it means to desecrate a human body. In some states, a human body is considered property or quasi-property, and in other states...
And what does that mean?
That's a really good question. So quasi-property would tend to suggest that, well, these bodies can be bought or sold. But what quasi-property meant in Old English common law was that the relative of that deceased body has the responsibility to properly inter or bury the body. So that even though it sounds like a right of property, and when we think about property, we can destroy it, we can sell it, we can barter it, we can trade it, just like we would a carton of milk or a carton of eggs or these wonderful mugs that you have here. But instead it didn't mean that in England. And the cases grew out of people needing to bury their loved ones and doing it properly. So nuisance cases, right? Neighbor next door smells something terrible. Right. What's going on next door? Turns out the neighbor next door has his mother sitting in the living room, and she's been in the living room for the last 3 months.
Why?
Or sister on the other side, she's been tossed into the furnace because they can't afford to bury. So you think about how expensive, even today, it can be.
To bury somebody.
Right, to bury somebody. So in England, there were people stuffing their relatives in furnaces or the fireplace or letting them rot in the living room. And courts then developed what we call a common law.
What year was this?
Oh, these are in the 1800s.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
I think a little better.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
But it's because
still,
the relatives
yes.
or the neighbors saying, look, this smells.
Yes.
This is a nuisance to our neighborhood. Then courts developed what some in the United States call a legal fiction. And that legal fiction is that, well, there's a property interest. There's a responsibility that one has to properly bury the dead.
Yes.
And it's a quasi-fiction because it doesn't entitle you to sell your relative. But it does require that you bury them properly.
Wow. Oh, my goodness. Thank you. Please hold that thought. We're going to be right back.
Can you believe they took all of them, all these kids, just for the wants and the needs in prison? Sure.
Thank you so much for staying with us. We are back with Professor Goodwin from the University of Minnesota, and tonight she's talking to us about the trafficking of human parts. So, Professor Goodwin, you are an advocate against the trafficking of human parts. Which country or which region is rampant with this?
Well, it's global. And rampant is a wonderful way of describing it to suggest that, well, there's more in some places and a little bit less elsewhere.
Yes.
But what my research has revealed is that this is global. So from India, South Africa, the Philippines, Brazil, to the United States. Just a couple years ago in the United States, a rabbi in New Jersey, Itzhak Rosenbaum.
Rabbi?
Yes, rabbi. Was arrested, yes, along with numerous corrupt politicians. It was a huge dragnet. But he was arrested because he had been sponsoring an international human trafficking ring in kidneys. He would recruit Israelis and claim that they were somehow related to Jewish people in the New York, New Jersey area that needed organs. And he profited by the tens and tens and tens of thousands, according to the indictment brought against him. So we're talking about something that is of global scale. So we have people from the United States who have significant demand for hearts, kidneys, lungs, livers. We have people from Israel who express the same demands, people in Germany and England, and they go all over the place. And it's important to distinguish the difference between the demand for human body parts, such as organs, versus the demand for human body parts, such as tissues, heart valves, tendons for knees, and things such as that, even foreskin from babies. Huge huge cosmetic demand. So cosmetic companies and also companies that process human tissues to do any number of things with those tissues, but that end up bringing some benefit for us, only we never really know about it. So the next time a person goes in for a knee operation and they're told which kind of bone do you want, human bone or pig bone, well, they just think, well, there was some legitimate process by which this bone was obtained.
Okay.
But what we know is that there are lots of gaps in the system, so that sometimes there are bodies that end up in the stream of commerce where there's never been an explicit agreement to donate. There are chop shops run throughout the United States. Just a few years ago, Michael Mastromarino, he is a dentist who had a fancy practice in New York, indicted because he was buying body parts from funeral home directors. He'd go to funeral home directors.
He's a dentist, so what is he using?
Well, he lost his license to practice because he was intoxicating himself on drugs used in his dentistry practice, and he was turned in by his assistants. After that, he realized there were other ways of making money. In fact, more money than what he made as a dentist, as a fancy dentist. He set up 3 biobanks. And these biobanks processed human tissue and sold it across the United States and across the world. He pillaged body parts from funeral homes in the Bronx, in Harlem, in Pennsylvania, and then sold them all over the place. Falsified records. And his agreements generally were, I pay you $1,000 to get access to one corpse, and $1,000 per corpse. And in exchange for that $1,000, I get access to that body part late at night or whatever. They would stuff plumbing piping back into the bodies after pillaging the bodies of bones so that it wouldn't be deflated, so that when the relatives came for the funeral, it would look as if the bodies were whole. What relatives did not know is that their deceased loved ones had been pillaged for parts.
Wow. So
it's shocking. This is the kind of thing that most of us, we don't imagine. We can't imagine. Bodies are so sacred. Bodies at death, perhaps even more sacred. I mean, we allow our bodies to go into the military. We allow our bodies to be in the salons, right? Or the filing of our nails and the things like that. We allow our bodies to be consumed with smoke if we work for fire departments, or we allow our bodies to stand the potential to be shot at if we're police. But there comes a time for the human body where we really do sort of treat it as sacred, and that's that point at death, right? Where at that point we really believe, hands off the body, unless it's donated explicitly with an explicit informed consent to a university or something.
So, so would you say, like, for example, now we're going to do our driver's license or renew, and we're being asked, oh, do you want to be a donor? And you mark donor. So who gets that body? Is it the government that gets it, or does it go through to these crooks?
This is a very good question. In that particular process, that's an above-board process, although lots of people worry about it. You have some people who worry that, well, if they agree at the Department of Motor Vehicles to be an organ donor, that if they're at the hospital and there's something wrong with them, that doctors won't try to save their lives. Now, that's a myth. Although some people say, you know, we'll provide stories. When I did hundreds of interviews for my book, Black Markets, The Supply and Demand of Human Body Parts. This book. We did lots of interviews, and the narratives were fascinating. When I did qualitative interviews with folks, and you know, and they would tell stories. You know, my uncle went to the hospital and he only had a broken toe, and 2 hours later they said he was dead. And we think that they took his body parts. Well, you know, those are kind of fantastic ruminations that people think about. So the process through the Department of Motor Vehicle, it's a legitimate process. Interestingly enough, it's a process that may not always lead to those people who agree to donate actually being donors. What about if they don't have their driver's license on them when they die and they're at the hospital? Many hospitals are actually a bit reluctant or loath to harvest organs if they don't have explicit first-person consent. So that even if the relatives say, well, take the kidney, do whatever you want, hospitals don't want to be sued. They don't want another relative appearing and saying, what did you do? You took the relative's body parts. But that said, there has been fraud in the system. There's been fraud related to people rising on the list perhaps speedier than they should. Sometimes doctors helping to facilitate that process by placing their patients in intensive care units, which would give them a point up on getting higher on the organ transplant wait list than somebody who isn't in intensive care.
I have one question that came to my mind, but we'll get to that when we come back.
All right.
Please stay with us. We will be right back. Thank you for staying tuned to us tonight. We are still with Professor Goodwin at the U of M, still talking about the trafficking of human parts. Thank you, Professor. And the question I was going to get to before we went on break was, would you say that doctors are the ones behind the trafficking of human parts, or who are those behind
Not
this?
always. Sometimes it's doctors. In India, about 5 years ago, there was a person arrested, euphemistically called Dr. Death, who was responsible, said to have profited perhaps somewhere in the millions on human trafficking. You know, to get a kidney on the black market, one ends up spending somewhere between $150,000 to $250,000. The person who ultimately is the vendor of that organ receives maybe $1,000, maybe $3,000. Supposedly, Isaac Rosenbaum's victims, if you were, received about $10,000. So you see that huge gap.
Yes.
So who's making money in that in between? Sometimes it's people who call themselves transplant coordinators, who are really body part brokers. They make a lion's share, and then they build in luxury systems that are associated with this. So it's not all that, you know, there's the person who needs the organ pays $150,000, $200,000, and the person who ultimately surrenders it maybe $3,000, and in between one person making $140,000 to $200,000.
Yes.
It's not that, because often the body part brokers and coordinators will provide business class airfare for the organ recipient and also a companion to travel to a luxurious location. Sometimes the recovery is not a hospital or just partially at a hospital, but it's a luxurious 5-star location that's overlooking the ocean. So sometimes these are made into vacations almost for the people who actually need the organ. Yes.
Whoa. So that way they are cutting the system and nobody is really knowing what is going on.
Is there anything sacred? Is there anything that somehow doesn't end up in the sphere of someone trying to sell it and someone else trying to buy it? When you ask that question as related to the human body, it's the hottest commodity. You know, per inch, the human body is worth more than views at Central Park. You know, I mean, there's so much that can be reaped from one human body. There are biobanks that used to advertise on their websites before they found out that people like me actually go on and look at their websites, that one human cadaver brings in $250,000 in profit.
Wow.
Right? You're hard to find that kind of real estate, even in New York, where real estate is pretty expensive, right? And as biotechnology advances, and we have gaps in the law, then you have researchers, you have also crooks, you have some well-meaning people, you have some desperate people, and it creates this interesting melange that just sort of pushes systems forward without judges knowing quite what to do, without legislators being even aware.
In fact, that brings me to a question. You've mentioned about indictments. Are there more people being prosecuted?
Here's the difficult thing. Prosecutors sometimes are stuck. How do you prosecute a person for stealing a human bone? For taking an ankle? For taking an arm? So what we know and what's easy for prosecutors, you stole someone's purse. You stole their laptop. But what about when you've gone to the University of California at Los Angeles, where people have donated human bodies for research, and you've stolen bodies from there? What do we prosecute that as?
So
is that a general larceny?
Wow.
So prosecutors have brought cases in recent years. So there are the cases against Michael Mastromarino. In California, there are cases against Ernest Reed and Henry Nelson, who collaborated together to steal body parts from the University of California at Los Angeles, and from their medical school, their human cadaver donation center. So prosecutors try to go after these cases, but often it's somewhat clumsy. Well-intended, but clumsy, because we just haven't caught up
the legislatures haven't, with defining what these specific kinds of crimes are.
If the legislatures don't come up with how to prosecute, then it will be hard for the courts to actually prosecute.
Well, exactly, because you think about it this way. We have laws on the book, again, dating back to Old English common law,
yes,
about not desecrating the human body. But not desecrating the human body is a little bit different than stealing the human body and reprocessing it.
Yes.
Now, we could say that that's a desecration in the process, but there's something even more pernicious, perhaps, in this way. And yet, on the other hand, you'd have folks saying, but what else can we do? You have people who are in desperate need, whose lives are at risk of death. They need kidneys. They need livers. They need hearts. The more complicated, and that is complicated, but even the more complicated are the people who don't necessarily need. We've become so accustomed to having the fine-tuned body. You know, Superman, Superwoman,
yes,
right? You know, it used to be 50 years ago, if your uncle drank too much and his liver withered, he just died, and people got together and said, you know, Uncle Bill was going to die because he drank too much.
Yes.
Today, Uncle Bill is going on the transplant wait list. Let's get Uncle Bill a liver. That's one scenario. Or you take the super skier, the super jogger, the person who wants to jog forever, the person who's doing his or her first marathon at 50 or 60, and now needs a knee operation, right? Well, it used to be, they just walk with a little bit of a limp, or they stop running, or they stop skiing. But today, it's like, no, I can continue to ski until I fall down on my skis because I get to have an operation where I have new human bone, or somebody else's human bone new to me, put into my knee. And so part of what we need to do is think through the human psychology of where we are, where we make such demands on technology.
Yes, what do you think has brought us to this point?
Well, there are a number of things,
thinking?
Right? Well, in fact, I think we'd have to think about it holistically. We'd have to think about what pharmaceutical companies promise us, right? Think about those commercials, right? You know, so there's some beach scene, and there are pretty people on the beach, and the wind is blowing, and they look so happy. And then whatever the drug happens to be, it's like you could be happy like those people too. Just take our pill. Whether it's for the sleepy leg, whether it's for the erectile dysfunction. You know, it really doesn't matter what's being advertised because it all looks the same. And we're buying into a lifestyle. A lifestyle that includes sunny days, not like the rain we've been having in Minnesota. It includes some wealth, right? Because you're living on the beach.
Yes.
It includes comfort, casualness. Maybe we don't have to work because these people are on the beach during the daytime, so maybe they don't have to work. Right? It's all of that we're buying in, these systems of perfection. And so technology offers something pretty seductive in that it promises us that, well, maybe we can have that lifestyle and maybe we can get to perfection.
Whoa. So in the case of people who are being given like putting metal on their hip or their knee, so would you say it's because they don't have the money to purchase the actual bone?
That's also, you ask such wonderful questions. Sometimes that might be what's best therapeutically for that particular patient, right? Or it may be that at the facility in which that patient is getting services, that this is what is provided. So the use of human tissues may in fact vary clinic to clinic, hospital to hospital. Here in the state of Minnesota, there was a person who died from receiving tainted human tissue. Brian Likens, he was only 26 years old. Whoa. He went in for a routine knee operation that was an outpatient surgery where he was going to get a little chip of a bone implanted in his knee. He was quite the athlete. He was supposed to be out in 4 hours. Instead, he was dead within 4 days. He never left hospital care. Turns out the body part that was implanted in Brian Likens had been infected with a bacteria from human bowel. Turns out the cadaver from which they had drawn these particular body parts had not been refrigerated for nearly 20 hours. It was of a suicide victim who was over 70 years old. Now, Brian Likens had no idea about this, and as it turns out,
And he
his
was only
doctors
26.
yes, and his doctors didn't know either. So there are real gaps in the system because we have a legal rule called the learned intermediary rule, and it is a rule that says that, look, the doctors are the go-between. So the doctors are the ones who are supposed to keep us on the safe side. But you think about these scenarios, how can the surgeon has no idea where this body part came from.
Please hold your thoughts.
Yes,
we would be
absolutely.
right back. Thank you for staying with us tonight.
I see the sun in the hills where we are one, and I climb up so high to the diamond in the sky. Give me a star in mountains. Give me a star enclosure. Give me a star in mountains. Give me a star in mountains. Give me a star enclosure. Say whatever you feel and I feel and we feel, yeah. I'm breaking through these chains now. Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm tearing through the carpet. No, 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 I said there ain't no stopping me now. Give me a star in mountains, give me a star enclosure. Give me a star in mountains, give me a star enclosure. I said I'm finally free to be me, boy, you see, yeah. I left the past behind me, yeah, 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 yeah. There is no time to waste now, I'm gonna take the world on. No, 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 if you ain't good, then get out my way. Closure. Give me a star in mountains. Give me a star enclosure. I said I've been there before and no more. That's the door, yeah. I'm climbing up the rocks
We light this candle in honor of victims who have lost their lives as a result of human trafficking, and we hope that their soul rests in perfect peace. Thank you so much for staying tuned tonight. We are still with Professor Goodwin.
Haven't gone anywhere.
From Minnesota. That is a good one. From the University of Minnesota. I hope you have been learning a lot and shocked as I am tonight, but we are getting a wealth of knowledge from her. Does it mean that some of these body parts that they even trafficked are not safe?
Yes.
For the patient?
Oh, this is absolutely right. Because when these body parts are trafficked, particularly the human tissue, but also the organs. Mm-hmm. So imagine this, as was the case with Michael Mastromarino. Yes. He falsified records. He harvested body parts that were from people who died of cancer, HIV.
No.
It had other kinds of conditions, yes, and falsified the records. Can you imagine if you're the recipient of one of those
somebody
parts?
who died of cancer, HIV?
Or you think about this, someone who lives in a rural part of India, who suffers from malnutrition, mm-hmm. and may also possibly suffer from some other condition. Maybe there's malaria, or perhaps there's hepatitis B, or perhaps there's hepatitis A, or what have you, or meningitis, right? Any of these kinds of conditions, right? And particularly the communicable ones, like let's say hepatitis mm-hmm. B and whatnot, right? So those people, if they sell their kidney, then it's possible that the conditions in which they suffer from can then be transferred. Absolutely. Mad cow disease, we know that that's transferable, right? So these are the things that for us to worry about. Now, here's the interesting thing. The black markets have become incredibly sophisticated. So as it turns out, as scary as it might seem, the kind of quality of care that one might receive, these are systems that have been built up and that are quite sophisticated. Right? So there's sophisticated kind of testing that goes on. Now, it is not to say that the people from whom these organs are taken, that they could get good medical care after the transaction. The vendors go back to their communities, often do not have any kind of follow-up medical care at all. Right? Now, one more topic that I'd like to put on the table that you haven't asked about and that we've not covered in this particular book, but it's in subsequent books. The cases of women who provide reproductive services for Americans. So
yes,
it's not
I was going to,
were you going to ask about that? Yes. Okay,
like,
good. Yes.
You know, because I think I saw something.
Some more of my writings.
Yes,
you research. You're a great investigator. I'm telling you, she's a wonderful investigator. Yes.
Because you mentioned that in one of your writings, so I was like, okay, wait, are some people making babies for this purpose?
Yes.
I'm like,
yes.
God.
Yes. Now talk about inconsistent systems, right? So the National Organ Transplant Act, which was passed by Congress in 1984, prohibits all body part trafficking, selling. So it's illegal, even though, as I've told you, we have these systems. Yes. We have what I call the gray market system of these human tissues being sold all over the place, right? There's no congressional crackdown on that at all. And then the body part selling of kidneys, there's much more focus on that. Yes. But we focus not at all on assisted reproductive technology. And yes, there are people who sell their sperm. There are people who sell ova. For the people who sell their eggs, well, the prices can go as high as $100,000. But here's what's also interesting. What some are calling a kind of neo-colonialism of reproduction is that there are surrogacy communities that are developing in India, where there are communities of women who basically farm Americans' babies, right? So, yes. So you sort of get the blend of what we want here in the United States. Once you get this magic combination that's now sets of embryos, those are flown over to India, or maybe the whole process takes place in India, and then women are implanted. This is actually taking place in many communities throughout India. In India, the tourism, healthcare tourism industry, which is what it's being called, tourism.
Oh my goodness, healthcare tourism.
Yes, profits at about $2 billion a year. The portion just for reproductive services is a profit of about $500 million a year. And often these women have no legal rights, so that if the gestation doesn't take, or if there are too many, right, they have no rights. No rights whatsoever. If the family says, no, you have to terminate the pregnancy right now, or you have to terminate, you're carrying triplets, terminate one because we only want two. And all of these things, no rights.
And they do all that?
This is proliferating now, and somehow we think of this as being even better because there isn't the tension between the surrogate and the intended parents about who will be the parents, the legal parents of the offspring, right? So
because it's all the way from India.
Yeah, exactly, and they figure these Indian women don't want to go back to their little villages with a little white child, and so they think, well, this is fine because there won't be the tension, which we've had legal cases in the United States of people fighting for maternity. But it does open up other kinds of controversy for us, doesn't it? Right?
Yes, it does.
Human rights kinds of controversies. Controversies that relate to the value of a person. Controversies that relate to hierarchies and power relationships, even within the context of women.
Would you say this is what gave birth to your Institute for Global Child Advocacy?
Well, in part, that organization has sprung up because of my concern about the sexual exploitation of young people around the world. And that's that sex trafficking piece, which extends in so many different ways. And what I want for us to do is to think more creatively and in much more nuanced ways about what sex trafficking is. For example, forced underage marriage. The United States, until very recently, has not gotten involved in that topic in any kind of meaningful way because we respect marriage. We respect marriage as an institution. So we don't bother to dig down and say, well, but it's a 10-year-old who's being forced to marry a 30-year-old. That's trafficking.
Is that happening here in the United States?
Not necessarily in the United States. It happens in a number of places around the world where we can have a real impact. Or there's even the video sex trafficking of girls. Do you know that in the Philippines, a family will be paid $2.50 per session that they allow their daughter to gyrate nakedly in front of a laptop? Now, for the family, $2.50 means a whole lot.
Yes.
And they think, well, what's the harm? It's just sort of like a TV, and all she does is wiggle around or engage in play sex with a pet. But of course, this is pornography.
Yes.
And it's piped all around the world. And there are many different other examples of the ways in which children are being sexually exploited in the United States that we haven't yet developed the right kinds of mechanisms to deal with on any kind of consistent, informed basis. You look at this Jerry Sandusky trial and all of that, how till the very end the defense attorney said, well, the victims just want money from him. They just want publicity. But think about how hard it is for those kids to have come forward who are now young men.
Yes.
So there are many different ways in which we should begin to think about and unpack the ways in which children are abused and in systems of abuse.
Yes. And would you say that this is even happening more because some of the people in high places are connected?
Oh my goodness. Well, you know that a lot of these various systems that we've talked about cannot be facilitated without people in high places turning a blind eye, right? Or turning what they even would consider an informed eye. I mean, I've been in rural villages in India where judges have told me, look, what else can we do? It's custom, or it's just how these people are. It's, these people, this caste, they like to marry off their daughters. What can we do? right? Hands up in the air, right? And so sometimes it's judges, sometimes it's legislators. I've met with legislators in India and other countries in the world where they'll say that, look, we've passed a law. So long as we've written something down on paper, we've done our part. And we know that without enforcement, without good training, without education, without transition systems for families, for girls, for children, we can't bring about the change that's inspired by law, or that we hope the law will inspire.
Yes. Would you say that even some women are having children just to sell them?
Oh my goodness. Well, in some places in the world, there are children that are used for any number of purposes. That there are children who are being born where families know that they will end up being soldiers in war. And we're talking about child soldiers, not, sort of growing up in the sort of required military service of Israel, but no, knowing that at 7 or 8 years old, this child will be holding a gun, or at 5. Or that there are children that are born literally into brothels, where girls in particular communities will be expected to prostitute in order to generate an income for the family. Or even in the assisted reproductive technology realm, that there are children who are being born to be savior siblings. And a savior sibling is a child that's born specifically for the purpose of giving a body part. Whether it happens to be some bone marrow, stem cells. Yeah, seriously. And there are European courts that have said it's okay. In the United States, we've done it. So technology takes us to places that we don't, it takes us to places that on one hand seems to give us something good. It's manna, it's bread from heaven. Until we look in and we see just what we've sacrificed in the process. And that's the key point here, right? Which is that we often think that technology is all about the good. And very often it does provide a good, but we also need to be mindful of our history. You think about the Nazi German experimentation. Right? The bodies that were sacrificed in order for Germany to advance its medical technology and its medical experiments. Here in the United States, the same thing, radiation studies without people's consent. The infamous study known as the Tuskegee study, where there are African-American men in Alabama who had syphilis, who were provided by government doctors and doctors from Johns Hopkins and other places, just sugar pills. They thought they were receiving antibiotics. They thought they were receiving curative treatments, right? But what we wanted to study was how the body becomes ravaged by syphilis. And so we gave them sugar pills. And every year sent them certificates saying how great it is that you're a part of this experiment for us, or part of this research endeavor, right? So there are many instances in our quest for technological knowledge, in our quest to do something that renders a benefit for the greater good, where we trample on people who are incredibly vulnerable. And we can never lose sight of that. I hope we don't.
I hope not too. And the issue of hair.
Yes,
because I do hair, and
you do hair.
I do have
you know that that's
that
buy human hair. They want the real hair.
Yes, the real hair.
The real hair, not the synthetic hair.
Yes.
They don't want horse hair. They want it off of a woman from India, and then they want to texturize so it feels a certain way.
Yes. So, what is your take on that?
Well, the truth of it is, it's sort of as you asked a little bit earlier. What isn't in the trade, the human trade, the trade that involves the human body? It's hair, it's breast milk. You can go on eBay or one of these online, search it in Google, and you can buy human milk, and you can buy hair. Oh yes, right, so any number of things. There's so many things that end up in the stream of commerce now. Now, what do I think about it? Well, with the human hair, well, that's also complicated. Now, I don't go there. You see what my hair, but I know people who do, right? And I think that it's important that the people who do acquire human hair have some understanding of how it comes about and where it comes from. And that very often the people who are selling it, at least the people in India, are actually getting it from religious communities where
Yes,
people
like, I heard about getting it from the temple.
getting it from the temple. So there are people who are making their own religious pilgrimage and cutting off their hair for reasons very sacred to their communities. And on the other hand, you've got the brokers who then come to the temples and steal it or make a donation and then fly it to all parts of the world. And so you have Hollywood complicit in this because all of the Hollywood actors, they also want human hair to pump up their hair for, you know, their walk down the red carpet and things like that. Are they paying attention to where this all comes from? Think about this. Is that human trafficking? Is that participating in human trafficking when you know? So now all of the viewers for the show who know if they're getting some human hair, a significant percentage of that hair is coming from India. And there are other places around the world that people
now they
are
have
selling.
Brazilian hair.
Oh, exactly. Well, as you know, all over the place, right? So now that they know, are they also a part of a human trafficking conspiracy?
Oh, that is a big question. Oh my God.
Right? I mean, does voluntariness matter? I mean, years ago in England, centuries and centuries ago, people used to sell their hair so it could be made into lace. Right? So that's not new. Or you think about the human milk trade. Well, years ago, people sold milk too. Right? They were milkmaids. So sometimes these are just simply the sort of come around things that we've seen from, if not decades, centuries before. Do you know that in the United States, the ways in which we built, the sort of significant factor behind us building the most sophisticated medical research technologies happened to be because doctors pillaged graves and medical students did too? We advertised in major newspapers, if you come to this medical school X, you will have a human body to experiment, to work with.
Yes, I get that advice.
The centers of technology, the first centers at our medical schools were the anatomy departments, right? They were the big spaces. There were deans that okayed the pillaging of body parts. Do you know that in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh in particular, African Americans had to hire guards to protect their cemeteries because their cemeteries were pillaged for bodies so that they could be taken on to medical centers and used in experimentation. When the University of Georgia relocated its medical school or was doing some refurbishing, they found nearly 400 cadavers in the basement, all believed to have been blacks, former slaves, etc. So even what we benefit from today, the medical technology on which we sort of stand and develop, has its genesis and its origins to some degree in exploitation of the dead, and even exploitation of the living too, because slaves were rented out to medical institutions for them to be experimented on while living. It's very complicated.
It is.
It is.
Thank you so much for this wealth of knowledge.
It's
we
my
are so
pleasure.
glad to
Thank you so
have
much
you.
for having me on your show. I've always been impressed by you from the
thank
very
you.
first time that I met you. I was so happy that you came to the Human Trafficking Conference that I hosted at the U. And it's been wonderful being in touch and watching your show flourish and watching you flourish. It's just been fantastic for me.
Thank you so much.
You're
I'm
welcome.
grateful. This is a second chance for me.
Yes.
And this is a great privilege. When I started my career as a journalist, I was working on education because I believe with education you just keep learning and learning. But now flip to the other side, went through trafficking myself, and I came out on the other side now digging into this human trafficking issue, because I do know that it affects a lot of people, and no matter how educated you might be, you will find out that there's still something you don't know that you need to find out.
Well, and that no matter how educated someone is, she may become a victim of trafficking.
Right. Yes. You know, that is true.
Yes.
And I really want the public to know this, so we can be more aware of it.
Yes.
And you know, I think sometimes we just get caught up. See, for example, the human hair. Just like you said it, that doesn't mean we are all trafficking. If you're
Yes.
buying human hair, are you also
Yes.
involved in trafficking? So those are the things people really need to know,
Yes.
to start checking themselves.
Yes, yes.
Because
yes.
if we just close to say, oh, this one doesn't matter, but this
Right.
matters, no, we
Yes.
have to look at everything
That's
as a
absolutely
whole.
right. That's
So
absolutely right.
I'm so
Context
so
matters.
grateful. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And you've heard Professor Goodwin tonight. You can get in touch with her at the University of Minnesota Law Department. She's available online. Her phone number is there. And her email, you can contact her for questions if you have more questions for her. Thank you for staying with us tonight. God bless you. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
They took me from my home when I was just so young. I don't know who I am. I'm supposed to be your son. All they do is just treat me so bad. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I wanna live my life and live it forever, but they keep on bringing me back to this place. They trafficking me. They trafficking me all around this world. Wanted to talk to God today to say, help me get up out of this place you made. I can't believe you put me in this situation, but I know you can move mountains for me. Oh, this a house that I live my whole life. I don't don't wanna be here no more. They keep on just trafficking me and just don't wanna walk out the door. Help me get up out of this place. I just don't wanna live in this house no more. Trafficking me around the whole wide world. I feel like I'm a slave in this modern time. It's 2013. I just don't know how this world could be this way anymore. They're just trafficking little boys and girls all around the whole wide world, yeah. Just trying to tell a story to you now about my whole life and how they took me from my home and put me into this place. They sold me